Distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, and fellow history enthusiasts. And amongst those distinguished guests include, let's see, Senator Lonnie Hancock, the Supervisor Aaron Peskin, who spoke earlier, so Supervisor President, and also Mayor Tom Bates from Oakland. So, my apologies. So, and I'm sure there are other people who are elected officials who are here tonight. And if you are, please stand up. We want to recognize you for your contributions to your community. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much. So these are folks who take time out of their lives to commit to you. And so it's really important that we do give them the recognition. They get a lot of hard knocks. They're doing their best, and we appreciate the work that you're doing. So thank you for being here. Well, welcome to the Maritime Museum building, which is a testament to the indomitable spirit of the Works Progress Administration. This magnificent structure and the surrounding aquatic park serves as a beacon of resilience and innovation, and a symbol to the transformative power of human endeavor. Born during the depths of the Great Depression, Aquatic Park epitomized the WPA's mission to provide employment and revitalize the nation's spirit. From the hands of skilled artisans emerged this architectural masterpiece, a testament to the ingenuity and craftsmanship that prevailed even in the face of great adversity. The WPA's impact extends beyond the physical structures themselves. It fostered deep appreciation for the city's rich maritime heritage and strong engagement with recreating on the bay. Generations of San Franciscans have used this park, igniting their imaginations, improving their health, and engaging in community. Today, we're honored to have with us Gary Brechin, who's going to be speaking, president of the Living New Deal, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and celebrating the legacy of the WPA. Mr. Brechin's unwavering commitment has ensured that the stories of the WPA's impact continue to inspire and educate generations to come. Mr. Brechin's passion for the WPA stems from deep understanding of its transformative power, its ability to uplift communities and restore hope during a time of profound despair that my family experienced, as many of yours did, during the Great Depression. The Living New Deal's work has brought to light human stories behind the WPA's projects, revealing countless lives touched by its programs. And frankly, on the way over here, my sister was in the car, and she reminded me that the high school that we went to was built under the WPA, so that was a really nice little thing. In northern Maine, so far from San Francisco. So, as we stand here today, surrounded by the tangible legacy of the WPA, let us remember the profound impact it had on our nation's history. Let us honor the resilience of the American people who, in the face of immense challenges, found the strength and ingenuity to rebuild and enhance the quality of their lives and the lives of their community by creating these lasting legacies. Please join me in extending our deepest gratitude to Gary Brechin, a fearless advocate for preserving the WPA story and ensuring that its lessons continue to inspire us all. Mr. Brechin.
Well, thank you. Before I get started, because I'll forget otherwise, if you haven't gotten a map of New Deal San Francisco, please pick it up. There is some over there, and these are our calling cards. This was the first one we did, and it was done about 10 years ago. Since then, we've done New Deal New York City and New Deal Washington, D.C. We're launching New Deal Los Angeles, and then, because we learned so much in the process, I want to go on and come back because we've learned so much about New Deal San Francisco since then. I want to do New Deal Bay Area because it's all over. And so we will not forget Oakland, Berkeley, Marin, and all the rest of it. It's all around us. Okay. And then I also wanted to just acknowledge a few people who have been really, really important. The first being Ann Rosenthal, who made all of this possible. You can imagine what this room was like when it was covered with thick coats of paint. And Ann, I think, worked for 2 years, painstakingly revealing all of this. She also worked on Quake Tower, of course. She's one of the finest art conservators in the country, and unfortunately she's feeling under the weather and she couldn't make it. So she should be here. I also wanted to thank Stella Lockman, who was just up here. Where are you, Stella? Oh, there she is. Okay. Stella was responsible when she was working for the Museum of Modern Art for rescuing the enormous 40 by 40 foot WPA model of San Francisco and bringing it over to San Francisco. Yes. When we were working on cleaning it up, she said, "This is the best boyfriend I've ever had." I agree. And it looks like it's going to have a happy ending because it looks very much like it might find a home at City College, where it will also be a memorial to Tim Pfluger, our great art architect who was so responsible for so much that's great about San Francisco. And then finally, my husband, Bob Schlabowski. Where is he? There he is back there, who has made so much of the Living New Deal possible, as well as everything that I do. So thanks, Bob, for all that you do. Oh, there's so many more. We've got such a great team. But I just thought I'd go back to the beginning about 20 years ago. And how did this all happen? Well, I was an environmental writer for about 20, 25 years, and it was really getting me down. And then I wrote my book, my dissertation. Dick Walker was my dissertation advisor, Imperial San Francisco, Urban Power, Earthly Ruin, which is now out in audiobook. You can get it. But it was kind of a bummer to do environmental reporting, especially as we became aware of climate change. And I thought, there must be something better for my mental health. And I've been really interested in the WPA because when I was an undergraduate at Cal, I'd go up to the Berkeley Rose Garden and look at sunsets, and there was a plaque up there that says it's WPA. And I thought, well, we should work on a book about what did the WPA do for California. I started working on that with a photographer, and then fell down the New Deal rabbit hole, as so many people do, and I found, oh, there's a lot more than the WPA. There's the CCC and the CWA, the PWA, so many other agencies that left things for us, that saved my parents' generation. Because the first task of the New Deal was to put people back to work. But not just doing any work, doing socially beneficial work that would leave things for future generations, but at the same time save people from despair and poverty. And that, of course, has been the motivating force of the Living New Deal. It's grown over the years. I nearly wrecked it because I'm not an administrator, and then Dick Walker came on board, and he's every bit the administrator that I'm not, and he has built it into the nationwide team effort that it is today. As he said, we're over 18,000 public work sites, and when you go to our map online, it looks impressive, but we know we've got hundreds of thousands to go. We've scarcely scratched the surface on what the Civilian Conservation Corps did. It's everywhere. And this building and the murals in it are a good example of why we do it, because it's a place of joy. It's a place of optimism. In the midst of the Great Depression, this place and so many others, like the schools, the libraries, the airports, everything else, did so much to raise people's spirits at that time. Boy, don't we need that now. And as Todd was giving us a tour of the building, and he pointed out the pier out there that's falling apart, and I thought, well, isn't that what's happening to all of our infrastructure? Yes. All over the country, because 40 years ago, a very suave snake oil salesman convinced us that taxes are extortion and we shouldn't have to pay for it, which is why our infrastructure in the United States is now reaching third world status. But it's even more than that. I mean, what we're doing is we're uncovering a lost civilization. It's a lost civilization that my parents built but forgot to tell us about. And it's all around us. And that's what's so fascinating about it. It's everywhere, but we don't see it. I often say that civilization is built on sewers. And so many of the sewers that we rely on were put in place almost 90 years ago by the New Deal, and they're falling apart because we're not maintaining them. And we better in the age of climate change, because the sea level is going to be backing up into them. And what's life going to be like then, especially as they collapse? So, yeah, gross. That's right. But there's so much more. And this building and all that we're uncovering reminds us of that. Well, I just want to wrap up by saying it's the 90th anniversary of the beginning of the New Deal. It's also the 78th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations in San Francisco. And at the time, I've done a fair amount of research on that because that was spoken of at the time as one of the most important meetings in human history, perhaps the most important. Think of what people were they were still involved in the Second World War. And the nations of the world met in San Francisco to organize the United Nations, which was Franklin Roosevelt's idea. He named it, it was his idea. He wanted to make sure that nothing like that war would ever happen again. And of course, he was one of the few who knew about the atomic bomb. So he knew that the next war would be the last one. And so it was created in San Francisco. And it has been largely forgotten in San Francisco. And the mark of that is the appalling condition, the squalor in United Nations Plaza, which Larry Halpern designed to be a memorial to that great meeting here in San Francisco 78 years ago. So we must remember that, and we must remember that in 1941, in his State of the Union address, Franklin Roosevelt enunciated the 4 freedoms. 2 of those are in the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. 2 of them are not. But he said that we must also have freedom from want and freedom from fear. And of those 2, freedom from want is the most important because from that comes fear. And that was not just meant for the United States. After each one of those, when he enunciated them, he said, these are freedoms for everywhere in the world. And that's what the United Nations was supposed to accomplish. Unfortunately, Franklin died on April 12, 1945. I think that's one of the great scenes of history. Because of that, the United Nations was castrated in the cradle, and it never accomplished what Franklin hoped that it would. But his widow, Eleanor, of course, carried it forward as best she could with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights just a few years later. And we must remember and honor that as aspirational, what we could achieve, because ultimately what it means is a New Deal for the entire world, that the New Deal would be planetary. And I try to remember that when I get down these days, which is so easy to do, and come to buildings like this and remember the optimism of that time during the Great Depression, that the Roosevelts and the people that they gathered around themselves, like Francis Perkins and Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes, all of them, that they made possible. It was an extraordinary period. I hope you'll get the map and you'll learn more. Now, I want to introduce Gary Kamiya. Gary was born in Oakland, moved to Berkeley, thank you, my town for a while. And Gary is the outstanding historian of San Francisco now. When I was growing up, the historians who inspired me to learn about San Francisco and the Comstock Lode were Oscar Lewis and Lucius Beebe. Gary is their worthy successor today, and I'm sure he's doing the same for teenagers of my age to teach them and inspire them with the history of this great city. So thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you very much, Ray, for that very generous introduction. I'm not sure I can feel those footsteps, but I'm doing my best. I'm delighted to be here today on this extremely auspicious occasion. Not only are we celebrating one of the most inspiring moments in American history, the New Deal, but we are doing so in one of the most glorious manifestations of that mighty effort to be found anywhere in the United States, Aquatic Park and this magnificent bathhouse. Without Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, created during the worst economic crisis in our nation's history, this beautiful cove would look very different, and this extraordinary building would not exist. It's hard to think of another site anywhere in the country that so beautifully embodies the ideals of that era. Tonight I'd like to talk a little about the history of Aquatic Park in general and the bathhouse in particular. Now, Aquatic Park is one of the most magical beaches to be found in any city in the world. It's a sandy Shangri-La in the very heart of the city. Paris, we love the beaches you have created along the Seine, but no one has gone swimming in that river since Jean Moreau leaped into it in Jules and Jim. San Franciscans swim right here, including Supervisor Peskin, every day. But this wondrous little cove under the bluffs was repeatedly threatened by powerful business interests and repeatedly trashed by the city. It took an intervention by the federal government with the crucial help of 3 venerable aquatic clubs to preserve San Francisco's beloved swimming hole and create the park and bathhouse, now this beloved Maritime Museum, that the public enjoys today. People have always been drawn to this site. Native Americans lived in seasonal camps in the vicinity. During the gold rush, some Argonauts willing to trade a long walk into town for a beachfront residence erected 24 buildings near the shoreline. But as early as the 1860s, trouble in the form of heavy industry appeared on the scene. Until well into the 20th century, San Franciscans basically treated the bay as a giant toilet, and businessmen regarded the remote cove as a perfect place to flush waste material. 2 large factories opened here, the Pioneer Woolen Mills and Selby Smelters. But the cove had also become a popular bathing spot, adorned by several swimming houses. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the cove's 2 most venerable, beloved, and eternally bickering tenants, the South End Rowing Club and the Dolphin Club, moved here. See which numbers outdo the other ones here. I don't want to get assaulted. The former transported by barge in 1908 after the State Board of Harbor Commissioners kicked it out of its home in Mission Bay. The 2 clubs sat like feuding siblings at the foot of Van Ness near the present-day Sea Scout building. Another now-defunct swimming club called Ariel also had a clubhouse on the beach. These 3 clubs were to play a significant role in saving Aquatic Park. Now, it may seem odd that a trio of swimming clubs could stand up to big business and City Hall, the powers that almost invariably got their way in 19th century San Francisco. But these clubs punched or splashed far above their weight. competitive water sports of all kinds were far more popular in the 19th and early 20th century than they are now. There was even a brief mania for something called international tug of war. Still, the interests of swimmers, rowers, divers, and international tug-of-war practitioners, and the existence of an exquisite little beach 25 minutes walk from the Montgomery block, did not impress the city's commercial interests, who had hitherto successfully monetized every square foot of waterfront land they coveted. Their latest scalp had been Mission Bay, the place from which the South End Club had been unceremoniously booted. Mission Bay was once a 260-acre wonderland of marshes and waterfowl, but it was bisected by a long bridge and then inexorably filled in and was under the control of the all-powerful Southern Pacific Railroad, aka the Octopus. With Mission Bay converted to lucrative landfill, the Octopus and other powerful interests reached their tentacles towards the northern waterfront. San Francisco officials potentially stood in the Octopus's way, but City Hall was itself not exactly a paragon of environmental enlightenment. The authorities' heedless attitude towards the cove was demonstrated after the 1906 earthquake and fire, when the city used it as a dumping ground for vast quantities of debris from downtown. 15,000 truckloads of red brick rubble from the destroyed Palace Hotel, along with debris from Chinatown, utterly ruined the fine bathing beach, as the press reported. This profanation of the cove gave new energy to a long-standing movement, first voiced by famed landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, to turn it into a park. The three swimming clubs formed the Aquatic Park Improvement Organization in 1909 and began lobbying for a park. They staged an Aquatic Park Days, a festival whose swimming, diving, and rowing contests drew big crowds. Now, the press supported the idea of a park, but the business interests appeared to have the upper hand. As we've seen, developers coveted the land, and the Southern Pacific wanted to fill in the cove to build piers for its steamers. The State Board of Harbor Commissioners was also eager to get rid of the cove. As a first step, it approved a 1914 extension of the State Beltline Railroad, creating a trestle that ran above the water, cutting through the cove the same way that Long Bridge bisected Mission Bay. The Harbor Commission applied to the Board of Supervisors for permission to fill in the entire cove. Meanwhile, the city continued to dump massive amounts of debris on the beach, covering it up yet again and filling in some of the water. But public outcry swayed the Board of Supervisors, who listened to their outraged constituents and refused to allow the State Harbor Board and the Octopus to do to the northern waterfront what they had done to Mission Bay. In 1917, the city acquired part of the site from the Southern Pacific in a trade, receiving an additional $390,000 for use in building the park. But the city still had inadequate funding for the major work needed, and the citizens, alas, failed to put their money where their mouth was. Bond issues for the park were defeated in 1928 and 1932. Nonetheless, the city began work on the park. Construction of the municipal pier started in 1931. By 1933, the pier was its full 1,850 feet long. And don't get me started about the pier's current sad closure, which calls out for a reborn WPA, or the contemporary equivalent to which we have sadly been reduced, a civic-minded gazillionaire, to step in and save it. But by 1934, in the depths of the Great Depression, the decades-old dream of a public beach and park at the foot of Hyde Street was in danger of dying. City and state money had dried up. The city had to borrow money and even tools to continue. The project limped along for 2 years using private donations of equipment. But the city had one last card to play. In the summer of 1935, Assistant City Engineer Clyde Healy traveled to Washington, D.C. to ask a newly founded federal agency called the Works Progress Administration for help. The Works Progress Administration later renamed the Works Project Administration, had been created by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to provide jobs for millions of unemployed Americans. The largest New Deal program, its initial appropriation was for $4.9 billion, 6.7% of the nation's GDP. WPA workers constructed roads, bridges, and other public projects in almost every community in the country. San Francisco would be no exception. The agency approved Healy's request and committed $1.78 million for the job. Along with the zoo, Aquatic Park would be the most important of the many public projects carried out by the WPA in San Francisco. The work began in early 1936 when 782 WPA workers arrived at the waterfront site. This force consisted of 9 supervisory engineers and inspectors, 36 labor foremen, 284 skilled and intermediate workers, 453 common laborers, and a full team of artists and sculptors. The day that battalion of federally paid workers arrived at this cove 87 years ago, shovels and blueprints and paintbrushes in hand, is one of those little-known but indelible moments in the city's history. I think of it as San Francisco's D-Day, Democracy Day. There is no painting that records the landing of that motley People's Army, but the great frescoes at Coit Tower, of which we'll hear more in a moment, capture its spirit. The signature structure of the park was the extraordinary building we're in, the Bathhouse, designed by official city architect William Mooser, Jr. His streamlined modern masterpiece looks like a luxury liner, right down to the portholes and funnels, forever about to set sail for some happy destination. You expect to see P.G. Wodehouse and Cole Porter at the railing, in white flannels and Panama hats, martinis in hand. In the bleak 1930s, the Bathhouse was a joyous note. And the art commission to adorn the interior and exterior of the Bathhouse is just as memorable as the building itself. The artists were hired by the Federal Art Project and paid about $96 a month, just enough to live on. They were a remarkable crew and none more fascinating than the man tapped to head the project, a Minnesota-born artist named Hilaire Heiler. To say Heiler was a multifaceted man would be like saying Leonardo da Vinci showed a bit of promise. In the 1920s, Heiler had run a legendary Paris nightclub called the Jockey Club, where he played piano and rubbed shoulders with the avant-garde likes of Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. He also studied psychoanalysis with Otto Rank, one of Freud's closest collaborators, and he developed a brilliantly idiosyncratic philosophy of color, which is exemplified in the circular ceiling work right here in the Bathhouse that he called the Prismatarium. Heiler hired the talented and egotistical sculptor Benjamin Buffano, the pioneering African-American mosaic artist Sergeant Johnson, the gifted muralist Richard Eyre, who did the murals on this floor that were very recently restored and rescued, and others. Now, what's notable about the art in the Bathhouse is that it is abstract, dreamlike, and formalist, reminiscent of European avant-gardists like Kandinsky or Yves Tanguy. Actually, Heiler's murals go beyond Kandinsky. They look like SpongeBob SquarePants on psilocybin. Now, this modernism sets it apart from the vast majority of WPA-funded art across the United States, which exemplifies a genre called American scene painting or social realism, figurative, broad-shouldered celebrations of the American heartland. The aforementioned murals at Coit Tower are classic examples of this dominant WPA style, albeit with a more left-wing slant than most, thanks largely to the influence of the Mexican communist artist Diego Rivera, who had executed 2 commissions in San Francisco in 1930. Indeed, a controversy over 2 explicitly pro-communist murals at Coit Tower led officials to paint over the tower's windows, delay the opening, and finally paint over the offending images. Now, the artists who created the works in the Bathhouse made no such political statements in their work, but they too became deeply involved in a raging controversy, one that was ultimately just as political as the Coit Tower battle. Aquatic Park was dedicated on January 22nd, 1939, in front of massive crowds. But trouble had been bubbling up behind the portholes for more than a year, and it boiled over just before the opening, when Hyler angrily resigned. Artists Benny Bufano, Sergeant Johnson, and Richard Eyre also walked off the job. The artists' resignations were the result of a yawning chasm between their idealistic vision of the Bathhouse as a public amenity, a vision shared by the WPA, and the crasser reality of the Bathhouse once the city began to actually operate it. The WPA paid for 99% of the Bathhouse, but had always planned to turn it over to the city, and the city, which was broke, lacked the resources to run it. So to raise revenue, in 1938, the city made the ill-fated decision to bring in two restaurateurs, brothers Leo and Kenneth Gordon, who set about turning the building into a bar, nightclub, and restaurant called the Aquatic Park Casino. There was no gambling that went on here, it was just called the casino. The Gordons convinced city officials to make major changes to the building's interior, including turning an open area on the third floor, this floor, which was supposed to be a public lounge, into a banquet hall, and adding orange and green cocktail furniture and what Hyler termed a, quote, large and horrendous clock. All of these changes were made without Hyler's consent. For a man whose sensitivity to color verged on the maniacal, the sudden appearance of orange and green cocktail furniture in his spectral sanctum sanctorum must have been like being a curator at the Met and discovering that all the Vermeers had been replaced overnight with Thomas Kincaids. The WPA wasn't happy either. Irritated by the slow pace of work and the concession given to the Gordons, WPA officials ended their participation in the project early, meaning the Bathhouse and Park was unfinished when it opened. Despite the fact that it was unfinished, despite the fact that the beaches had not yet received sand, and despite the storm and drawing behind the scenes, the park was initially a big success with thousands flocking to the beach to enjoy a swim in the bay. But soon both the public and the press became increasingly dissatisfied with the way the Bathhouse was being run. And once again, the villains were the Gordons. In the egalitarian spirit of the times, the city and the WPA had described the Bathhouse as a palace for the public. Now, perhaps any concessionaire would have had trouble living up to that billing while still making the Bathhouse a going concern, but the Gordons were egregiously awful tenants. They set prices so high that most patrons were discouraged, and they treated the public in a heavy-handed and exclusionary manner. On one occasion, a WPA investigator, and it's telling that WPA had investigators checking out the casino, observed a group of schoolboys bringing their lunches to the open veranda overlooking the cove. They were ordered to leave by the concessionaire, the investigator reported. Now, as we've seen, the conversion of a people's palace into a private casino did not sit well with the artists. In April 1939, Benjamin Bufano wrote a letter to the WPA administration stating he would not allow his 14 sculptures to be displayed because the project had deteriorated into a private enterprise. The Chronicle quoted the shaggy-maned sculptor as saying the average person was, quote, placed in an embarrassing position if he does not purchase refreshments while passing through, and, quote, the very people for whom the center was created are discouraged. Sergeant Johnson and Richard Eyre also resigned in protest, Johnson leaving his 140-foot veranda mosaic unfinished. It's unfinished to this day. So while the art in the Bathhouse may be formalist, dreamlike, and peaceful, the artists who created it shared the same public-spirited vision and politics as their colleagues who had worked on Coit Tower 5 years earlier. Happily, a public outcry led the city to throw out the Gordon brothers, and after many other only in San Francisco twists and turns, including the creation of a beach using sand from the excavation of the Union Square parking garage, and the vision and zeal of Carl Kortum, the father of what is now the San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park. Aquatic Park and its wonderful bathhouse finally became the public treasures they were always intended to be, joyous and enduring monuments to that shining moment in America's darkest hour, the New Deal. Thank you.